Going into the 20th century, the United States was coming off the high of the Industrial Revolution. Laissez-faire policies by the government had allowed private enterprise in America unprecedented growth and expansion. However, without any form of regulation, things were at this point out of hand. Workers were putting anywhere from 60 to 80 hours of work a week. They were paid under $1 per day. Women and children were worked just as hard and in extremely hazardous conditions without benefits of any kind, as well as the formulation of trust caused a pandemic of unfair prices where people had no choice for lack of any alternative. Industrial giants such as Rockefeller, Carnegie, and above all, J.P. Morgan, referred to as the king of both Wall Street and Pennsylvania Avenue, were believed to have more power than the president. These American titans were fueled by the New World's vast wealth of resources. However, everything has its limits. In 1900, the buffalo population of North America, which at one point roamed in herds numbering in the millions, got so low as 500. With hundreds of acres of forest falling to industrialization a day, animals and environments unique to North America were going extinct. Combined with the threat of renewed imperialism by European powers, these challenges would be faced by the bull moose because of his belief in Noblesse Oblige. By confronting the old guard, establishing national parks, and maintaining fantastic foreign policy, Theodore Roosevelt took a stand for those who couldn't stand for themselves. On June 2, 1902, in the Pennsylvania and Virginia region, nearly 200,000 coal miners went on strike. Organized by the United Mine Workers Union, they demanded better working conditions and wages. However, the mine operators refused, and so the strike persisted. 6 months later, with winter coming, the American people needed coal. Without it, potentially millions would freeze to death, and this forced the president to enter the stalemate. However, in the most Rooseveltian of ways, he defied precedent and called for a conference between the union and company leaders to negotiate. The meeting took place on October 3rd at the temporary White House at 22 Lafayette Place, Washington, D.C., between the mine operators and John Mitchell, president of the Coal Commission. While after 20 days of negotiations, a compromise was eventually reached that was able to end the strike. There would be an anthracite coal commission of third-party experts to investigate and decide fair conditions for the laborers. This was a huge statement by the president, which was celebrated as a victory for the laborer. However, this started a war which Roosevelt would fight for the rest of his presidency. He fought for what he called his square deal for the American people. On September 7, 1903, at the New York State Fair, Theodore Roosevelt said, "Let the watchwords of all our people be the old familiar watchwords of honesty, decency, fair dealing, and common sense. We must treat each man on his worth and merits as a man. We must see that each is given a square deal because he is entitled to no more and should receive no less. The welfare of each of us is dependent fundamentally upon the welfare of all of us." However, there were many who tried to stop Roosevelt. While he was of the Republican Party, he became the figurehead for progressive ideals, which caused extreme contention with the old guard Republicans, who were staunch conservatives and firm believers of laissez-faire. They would defend private business from any government interference. However successful or popular Roosevelt's actions were, they would continue to fight him throughout the entirety of his presidency. Huge figures like Senators Hanna and Aldrich, who were heads of the GOP, dominated in an almost uncontested majority in all forms of politics. In 1901, they had 206 of 350 seats in Congress. Wall Street, who were supported by the GOP, were also prominent opponents, and they made use of large-scale corruption of politicians. Those forces all worked together to conspire to put Roosevelt as the vice president after the current one, Garrett Hobart, passed, a position at the time that was effectively a career ender. During the Republican National Convention of 1900, Roosevelt was selected to be vice president, even against his own wishes. After the election was won, however, Republicans were on their toes as the general shared thought was summed up in one quote by a Republican senator: "McKinley's greatest responsibility now is to stay alive. He's the only thing between that cowboy and the White House." However, many months later, that cowboy was inaugurated as the 26th President of the United States after McKinley's tragic assassination by a lone assassin in Buffalo, New York. Now, Roosevelt had the ultimate opportunity to enact Noblesse Oblige and take a stand for progress. But did he have the ability? Railroad regulation was a big issue at the time. Railroad companies would charge ridiculous rates out in the West, where secluded towns had no choice if they wished to transport their products for sale. However, his initial railroad regulation was defeated in the Supreme Court, as after the Supreme Court decided with the trust that it was unconstitutional. The Senate also refused to pass multiple proposed legislation in his first years in office. while he was later able to pass the Hepburn Act of 1907. This portrays how the political field looked for Roosevelt at this time. But Roosevelt was a superb statesman and knew how to win.
Political parties exist to secure responsible government and to execute the will of the people. From these great tasks, both of the old parties have turned aside. Instead of instruments to promote the general welfare, they have become the tools of corrupt interests which use them impartially to serve their selfish purposes.
This battle, unofficially started by the Anthracite coal strike, would be officially started with the suit against Northern Securities, the largest railroad company the world had ever seen. A combination of the railroad empires of James Hill, Edward Harriman, and J.P. Morgan. Roosevelt and Philander Knox, the Attorney General, spent months writing this suit to show that by the Sherman Antitrust Act, this trust had an unfair monopoly on the railroads of the Northeast. For years, this case was watched by the nation. This wasn't seen as Northern Securities versus the United States. It was seen as Theodore Roosevelt versus Wall Street. The best lawyers money could buy and the power of Congress behind them allowed Northern Securities to fight the suit for almost 3 years. Finally, in 1904, the Supreme Court made their decision and Northern Securities was broken up. It was the ruling heard around the country. This was the point where the government was truly shown to be more powerful than big business. Here was a turning point in Theodore's war on the trust. This victory, combined with the incredible victory in the 1904 election after the loss of Senator Hanna, also showed the turning point in Roosevelt's fight with the Senate. In 1906, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair gripped the nation with its shockingly graphic tales of meat factories and the horrors of what went into people's food. Theodore Roosevelt then proposed the Pure Food and Drug Act, which had major reforms for the industry. This was just one of dozens of government labor reforms passed by the president in this time. The next battle was one fought for something that, while predominant today, was unheard of at the time. This was the push for environmental conservation, a lifelong struggle of the president fought for ever since his time in the Baylands of North Dakota. He was quoted as saying, "We have fallen heirs to the most glorious heritage a people ever received, and each one must do his part if we wish to show that the nation is worthy of its good fortune." After instituting multiple national parks and monuments throughout his presidency, the return of conservative backlash against him during his second term, also referred to as the treason of the Senate, saw an obstacle in this task. When they started to refuse national parks, he passed the Act for the Preservation of American Antiquities on June 8, 1906. This gave him the power, for example when Congress refused to make the Grand Canyon a national park, to establish it as a national monument without congressional approval. He also created the United States Forest Service to run these sites. Roosevelt used his authority to protect wildlife in public lands by establishing 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments. Because of his work, he was able to keep species such as the buffalo and other big game from going extinct. On May 5, 1908, Theodore Roosevelt held a governor's conference to raise awareness and make plans for future efforts of conservation to be continued for years to come. Here he stated, "We have become great because of the lavish use of our resources, but the time has come to inquire seriously what will happen when our forests are gone, when the coal, the iron, the oil, and the gas are exhausted, when the soils have still further impoverished and washed into the streams, polluting the rivers, denuding the fields, and obstructing navigation." In March of 1909, Roosevelt finished his terms, having almost single-handedly started the progressive era in the U.S. and is credited as being the first modern president. In his time, he signed over 800 executive orders, filed 40 legal suits against monopolies, successfully created regulations that protected consumers as well as laborers, and designated over 230 million acres of land as national parks and or monuments. His legacy is seen in how he changed the power and role of the president, the responsibility of the government, the dozens of national parks and species that exist today because of his interference, and for the popularization of Noblesse Oblige and its values. As Uncle Ben said, "With great power comes great responsibility." Theodore Roosevelt took a stand for change. He was a voice for the voiceless, a man for the common people.